I open the 110th session of the trial. We shall now listen to the summing up by the Attorney General. Before that, I give decision number 100. I decide that the summing up of both parties will be recorded by a shorthand typist, and that in accordance with my decision of the 30th June 61. Please, Mr. Hausner.
If it please the court. In this trial, we see before our eyes the picture of a regime which threatened our generation and was a menace, according to which an end was to be brought to the freedom of nations and freedom of individual. Here, the shadows of Adolf Hitler and his accomplices are hovering around us. These are those ghoulish personalities that humanity is going to remember them forever. Adolf Eichmann, who is standing trial before you, acted as his leader and perpetuated the crimes thrust upon him, on the leader. And he was the instrument of the destructive force. What was he doing? Towards the outside world, he would resort into prevarications and into glib tongue in order to conceal the bottomless hatred and murderous fury. For 2 months, the survivors of this terrible Holocaust have taken their places in the witness box, and they have given their testimony here. Each has told of that segment of the terrible tragedy of which he was asked to testify, until the picture of the great horror emerged. We were shocked to hear of murder, brutality, tortures and atrocities, which, had they not been described by living men and women, it would have been possible to believe that they have been perpetrated by human hands. We have heard of acts of cruelty and lust for evil, degradation, oppression of body and soul, the like of which have never been known in the annals of mankind. We were shaken when Auschwitz, the ashen planet, which the Nazis sent into orbit in the skies of Europe, from whose soil Jewish blood welled forth and in the form of a spout. All this has been depicted to us. We have heard of rabbis and servants of the Lord ordered to put on their phylacteries and praying shawls and thrust into the flames amid the mockery of their tormentors. We saw before us the tortures in the camp, the lashes, the degradation, humiliation, and we have been horrified to see the depth of wickedness to which men can sink in their behavior to their fellow men. We have heard of rats put into the clothing of the prisoners at Helmno, while they were ordered to stand without moving a muscle. We heard of the parachute game of the camp staff, who told the Jews to climb up to the roofs and jump, and whoever did not jump properly was shot. We have heard of dogs being set on human beings with the order, man seize the dog. We have heard of boys being hanged to the sound of merry marching songs played by the camp orchestra, of babes and sucklings thrown alive into the fire after their mothers had protected them with their bodies and saved them from asphyxiation in the gas chambers. I believe that if any man should try to imagine a nightmare, he would not succeed in inventing even one tiny fraction of the appalling things that have been presented and described here. All these things have been heard by the man who sits in the glass dock. We have seen him watching observantly, taking in the testimony, following descriptions, looking at the films that have shown all the horrors of the hell, and then came his turn to testify. It might have been expected today, at least, 16 years after the limbs of the Nazi Hydra have been severed, he would at least utter one word of regret and repentance, one syllable of remorse. Instead, his testimony began with the well-known Nazi falsehood about the war that was forced upon Germany, and his cynicism reached the point of declaring that the war against Jewry was also forced upon the German people. He had declared that he does not believe in regret, since it would be childish, for the dead cannot be restored to life. In what does he believe? That the oath of allegiance which he swore to Hitler absolves him from all responsibility for his deeds and serves to justify completely whatever he has done. This we have seen during the weeks in which he has given his testimony. And later we saw him skulking among the documents, brazenly denying facts that cry out from every piece of evidence, searching for excuses and pretexts, every one of which is designed to conceal and cover up the crime of the blood that has been spilt, and his share in this great monstrous crime. To achieve this, he's been ready to deny his own statements, to recant his own confessions, to claim that documents have been forged, that witnesses and even his own testimony are mistaken. that reports are false and that phrases in official papers are incorrect. That is what he has to say in the face of what he himself calls one of the most terrible crimes in the history of humanity. The paper barricade and prevarications that he has tried to erect with such care and diligence, with a view to casting off responsibility so as not to see, not to feel, and not to hear. This is a characteristic feature of the Nazi. There is no escape from the question that has faced us in this court from the very first day. In what caste were they molded? Those whose work this was, those whose deeds these were, those who created this reality, and who thus defend themselves when the time comes to face justice. Counsel for the defense has spoken of the two worlds that face each other. The depth of suffering and the heights of power. The world of the Caesars, he said, knows no tears. True. Tears are known only to the man who has a human heart within him, who is capable of being moved by the sufferings of his fellow men. He that has a heart of stone is neither moved nor shocked, even when he is brought face to face with the horror of his hideous actions. When he is brought to judgment, he is capable of a wily struggle, compact of falsehoods and evasions. For the leader declared that a lie should be repeated so often that even others will begin to believe it. Indeed, the worlds face each other here. This is quite true. But the world of the dictator is not the height of authority, but the lowest depth of hatred. And it is the world of the victims that has brought to all men on earth the tidings that were heard on Sinai and the supreme command, "Thou shalt not murder." Thus Israel has stood from days of yore, face to face with the men of hatred, vengeance, and arrogance. Thus stood the forefathers, and thus the children too will stand. And the Philistine said unto David, "Come to me, and I'll give thy flesh unto the foes of the air, and to the beasts of the field." Then said David to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast taunted." These are the two worlds, and this is their meeting.
Dr. Grieber,
the saintly Dr. Grieber, He gave us the definition of the Nazi soldier, the Landknecht, who casts away his conscience when he puts on his uniform, who from then on remains completely indifferent to the suffering he causes to others, who rejects every plea and is unwilling to pay the slightest heed to requests to alleviate the suffering. Adolf Eichmann was cold and unyielding even towards his fellow countrymen. Dr. Gruber saw before him when speaking to this man, as he said here, a gaping chasm of hatred. In one rare moment, when Dr. Gruber stood in front of him, tired and broken, pleading for the life of a Jew, Eichmann showed some kind of feeling. And what did he say then? Why do you bother, Dr. Gruber, with all this activity? The Jews will never be grateful. This is from where, the judges, were the poisonous wells that these people drew the strength to trample human beings like vermin, to tear babies limb from limb, to engage in the dispatch of people to death for more than 5 years. It is horrifying to realize that whoever set his foot on this path no longer has a way back to human values. For this doctrine destroys his heart and transforms him into a chilly block of ice and marble wrapped up in documents, orders, instructions, and proclamations. It is with these that the accused and his like try to protect themselves when they find themselves in the hands of the law. Truth and falsehood no longer have any normal meaning for such men. Truth is whatever serves their purpose. Falsehood is whatever hinders them. This is the devious path of the Nazi from the beginning to the end. If there is regret in their hearts, it is because the loathsome work was not completed. If there is sorrow, it is because the means that were chosen were not effective enough to complete this task. After this poison has penetrated into the soul, and the subject has broken free from his duty as a human being to weigh moral values and examine his path by the light of conscience, the ground has already been prepared for the phenomenon that was named the final solution. There were no moral impediments anymore, no further brake on crime. On the contrary, there was justification, enthusiasm, and the ardent desire to carry out the evil design loyally to the end. This group, which raised Hitler to power, believed in the doctrine of hatred against whoever stood in its path. This was no mass hypnosis or other psychological phenomenon in which men were gripped without possibility of liberation. It was an act of the will, deliberate and conscious. On the part of the gang of criminals which came to power, it was also a matter of meticulous and careful calculation. This wave of evil raised to positions of high authority and tremendous power men who saw in Nazism an opportunity for a career and a share in the administration, good salaries, comfortable living conditions, and who were prepared for these ends to give support to any abominable conspiracy. Not really. The hatred knew no bounds, geographical, social, or familial. Envy and fanaticism filled their hearts, envy of the belongings of others, lust and thirst for foreign territories and property that was not theirs. Their fanaticism led them in public to burn spiritual treasures, and at home to snatch the New Testament from their wife and tear it into shreds. How did this wave of hatred, evil and murder swell up? Why did Adolf Eichmann leave Austria, where he grew up and was educated, and why was he drawn to Nazi Germany? What attracted him to the false lure of the Nazi doctrine? What induced him to enter the service and to execute for them one of the most hideous and heinous projects? How could a human being do what he did? It would seem that a hatred-ridden dictator, when he finds people ready to accept his leadership, can lead them wherever he chooses, even to the depths of hell. Here too, we have heard from Dr. Gruber of the growing evil of people entangled more and more in the bonds of thraldom and slavery, of the road from which there was no return. This was the regime which created the cyclists, as Dr. Gruber called them, who trampled those beneath them and bowed down to those above them, crushing those under them and displaying joyful, heel-clicking, fawning obedience to their superior, whatever his order may be. This and more. A complete casting off of moral restraints, or what they called bourgeois morality, for the achievements of the supreme goal. For this purpose, anything was permissible: falsehood, deceit, slander and murder. In their own eyes, and those of their friends, they remained decent people and useful citizens. Not only were they not assailed by pangs of conscience, But they even considered themselves divine figures who could and would carry out the terror to the full. One whose heart was prepared to absorb this theory of hatred was attracted to it even from afar. One who was ready to follow Hitler, and it should not be forgotten that he was chosen the first time by 40% of those who voted to the Reichstag, gave his consent, whether wholeheartedly or hesitantly, to what was done afterwards in the heart of Europe. Adolf Eichmann said in a statement made in Israel that he should be permitted to hang himself in public as a warning to future generations. Such ideas didn't trouble him. However, when he wrote of the solution of the Jewish problem in 1941, or when he wrote about the solution of the Jewish question in 1941, or when he announced that he would jump laughing into his grave at the end of the war, enjoy that 5 million Jews had jumped into the grave with him, then he would not have expressed such thoughts as he did here. It is clear, therefore, that his statement was meaningless verbiage. He was never ready to stand trial for his deeds and to face punishment for what he had done. Therefore he escaped and was hiding under an assumed name. From time to time I would relapse to my old ways, he said to us when we showed the Zassen text to him, and occasionally I uttered nationalist slogans in Argentina, he says. In other words, after 12 years, he once again began to believe in the Resch's doctrine of murder. Though there was no leader above him, he would believe again in the theory of murder and race discrimination. And when his tongue was loosened, he expressed his regret at the fact that Jory has still survived.
Now, when the time has come to judge Adolf Eichmann, I shall try to put together the central proofs declaring his crime, connect them to the commencement of this trial, to the indictment, and to the opening speech. My summing up will be divided to a verbal part, which will include the central arguments in regard to the legal importation of the proofs, connecting the accused with the accusations brought against him, to a part which will be submitted in writing, prepared by my colleagues, and which will follow the opening speech, pointing out the documents and proofs brought to court in order to prove their contents. In addition, I shall submit in writing a number of lists, additional lists, with further written proof.
disregard altogether.
Eichmann's network of lies was also evident here. At first, in the police examination, before he knew how many documents we have about the matter, he said at first that the marking 4D4 as a marking of a department probably was a misprint. He said the matter was entirely strange to him. Fremd was the German word he used. Whereas, in truth, he was then taken into the confidence of the chiefs of the SS and the ministers of the state in connection with this matter, and was taken into the confidence of the authorities in the occupied areas, and in their presence, in that meeting, he was told about the matter and he dealt with it for many long months, and it is simply impossible for him not to remember it. And indeed, later on, when he was shown the documents, then he spoke differently. Then he remembered. And this perhaps is an appropriate occasion to remark about his, quote, defective, unquote, memory, in which he from time to time sought refuge. Scores of times he replied in the cross-examination that he did not remember anything about important matters which must have been engraved in his memory. That's what he also told the court in reply to questions. This included the supply of gas to concentration camps by his department, the date of the decision of the final solution, or about the supply of bones, of skulls and skeletons, about the matter of his visits to extermination camps, the dissolution of ghettos, as to whether he saw the loading of Jews onto trains, the corrections in the so-called brown file, the instructions to the Einsatzgruppen, his activities in the government general area, and scores of other crucially important matters. In all of these cases, he only shows us his skill in reconstructing documents with the help of the books by Reitlinger and Polyakov and others. But his memory he is not prepared to put at the disposal of the court, because it is deficient. So that's what he says. I believe that it is only very rarely that one meets a man gifted with such an unusual power of memory as this accused. He is capable, if he wishes, to remember details and fragmentary small events and facts which occurred many years ago. He is capable of reconstructing without the aid of documents and written statements, but from his own knowledge, small and big matters which occurred long time ago. In order to understand the amazing capacity of his memory, it is sufficient to study the first 70 pages of his statement to the police and to study the memoirs which he wrote down, Exhibit T44, in order to find out that the man is capable today, after 20-odd years, to describe the details of conversations of that time, thoughts which he had then. He is capable of giving a detailed picture about conditions of service in that period, including the period of the extermination. He can describe how the rooms and the furniture looked then, the documents, the card files, who the men were with whom he met there, what they looked like and what their character was. He's capable to remember after 23 years what his military salary was when he served in Dachau. He can remember the food which he ate then, the auxiliary services which he did for his commander Fichel. He can even remember the shape of the paper on which he wrote his letters and the reports to Fichel, that it was perforated paper which bore numbers on top. In those memoirs which he wrote down here in Israel and gave to the police, he brought minute details about personal impressions, experiences, where he would spend the weekends and days of rest. He described his studies in elementary schools, the details of how he was accepted to work for the vacuum oil company, who recommended him, what the names of the officials were, what his salary was, his business trips, and scores of other little details. He quotes the name of the book from which he studied Hebrew at the time, and he says the name of the book was Ivrit Levad, Hebrew alone. And he remembers that the price of lentil soup 24 years ago was 35 pfennig, and a bread roll was given free, and that the price of beer was 45 pfennig a stein. He remembered whom he met on board ship when he traveled to the Orient in 1937, to the Near East, what the hotel was where he stayed, and other details which attest to an unusual power of memory. He forgot only one detail that he has already disclosed in writing and orally, probably without knowing that this would eventually be used against him, this amazing power of his memory. And that when he tries to seek refuge in obscuring his memory with regard to decisive and crucial matters, no one can believe him anymore. And in my latest remarks, I assumed that the accused was not free to leave his job of directing the Department for Jewish Affairs in the Gestapo. But from a factual point of view, this assumption is baseless. There did exist such a possibility if he had only asked for it. Himmler himself, when he spoke to a meeting of senior commanders in Posen, indicated that if a senior commander wanted to be transferred, he should be pensioned off because he proved that his nerves had been shattered. We also have factual proof. In the Nuremberg judgment, in case number 9, page 40 of our pamphlet, this is an exhibit in the present trial by agreement of both sides. And there we find mentioned the Noske incident. Noske's rank was equivalent to Eichmann's. He explicitly refused to carry out murderous orders against Jews. He did this openly. He was not shot, he was not demoted, he was not even tried. A certain degree of inconvenience was caused to him, and no more. Also, we have Best, on account of whom the anti-Jewish operation in Denmark failed. He did not suffer either. Eichmann harbors resentment against him to this very day because of that failure, and this can be seen in what Eichmann said in the police interrogation. Furthermore, defense witness 6, what does he say? I quote, "It was possible to be relieved of jobs in commanding the Einsatzgruppen without being involved in a court-martial or being demoted, even though it was considered an act of cowardice. There was always the possibility of being released from the RSHA and of asking for transfer to the front, or else of being released for some kind of other voluntary task." That is the end of the quote.
Eichmann
admits that he had never submitted a written application for transfer, that he had never addressed such an application to the chief of the RSHA. He says he has asked this of Müller, his direct superior, and when Müller refused, he did not appeal against that decision. His friendship of long standing with Kaltenbrunner, the man who had brought him into the party and the SS before the Nazis had ever taken power, this friendship enabled him to put in a personal recommendation outside of any service channels for the promotion of his colleague, Eichmann's colleague, Kraus. This is in document T1431. Is it conceivable that if he had grown tired of his murderous job, he could not have applied to his longtime friend and asked him to be transferred? Therefore, from the factual point of view, Eichmann's claim is not truthful, is based on a lie. If his superiors had known that he had wanted to go to the front, then as 6 says they should have let him go. This is what Eichmann's own witness testified, and I go further and I say, if they had sensed that his heart was not in this vast operation, they themselves would have transferred him elsewhere. But he did not want this. And we have quotations from him, from what he told Zassen. I have never asked for a transfer elsewhere. Of course, when I showed him the reprint here, it was in session number 95, he denied having ever said these things. And we have the words of his beloved friend Hess, who says that Eichmann was obsessed with a desire to exterminate Jews. And Hess spoke about Eichmann's psychological attitude towards this, and I shall discuss this later on. From the legal point of view, this does not add or detract to the guilt of the accused, because the assumption is that even compulsion and duress do not exonerate a person from responsibility. One must not murder even when one's own life is in danger. This is how it is according to Israel law, because duress does not exist in a matter of bloodshed. It is the same way according to our regular criminal
judgment when he sums up for the defense.
In view of the legal principles of conspiracy, 3 questions are therefore asked. First, what was the criminal conspiracy? Second, what was done in order to implement it? And third, what was Adolf Eichmann's place in this abysmal plot of horrors? The desire to cast the Jews out of Europe was transformed in 1940 into the Madagascar plan. I would not single out this plan here for discussion here, were it not for the fact that the accused wanted to draw credit from this plan and to point to it as well as an experiment by himself to seek an alleged positive solution for the Jewish problem and to give the Jews, in his words, firm soil under their feet. In Vienna still, as we saw from his letter and as we have shown in a document, He had considered the matter in his office. At that time already, he had in fact planned extermination by deportation to Madagascar. One can believe that it was the Stürmer and no other source which served as a source of inspiration for this plan. Incidentally, I have studied Adolf Böhm's book, and I have not found a trace of any Madagascar plan. And one must remember that we have to judge Eichmann when he planned the concentration of Jews in Madagascar, not in view of subsequent developments, not in view of the physical extermination which had not yet come up then, but in the light of pre-war reality and of reality before the order for physical extermination had gone out. The plan assumed its final form when the war had already broken out. Eichmann admitted that it had been processed and transferred by his department after consultation and negotiations with other officers. According to that plan, the local inhabitants of Madagascar had to be uprooted, all 4 million of them, to deport them from the island and to settle instead the Jews on that island, an island whose chief advantage was, and this was explicitly stated, that it would prevent its inhabitants from having any contact, including commercial contact, with other nations. There the Jews were to be under Gestapo supervision and would never attain independence. They planned to throw 1 million Jews onto the island every year. When one studies this plan of horrors, which came from Eichmann, will find out that the main design was to gain control over the Jews, to seize them and dump them on this island, banish them to a land of doom where they will be completely cut off from the rest of the world. And whether the Jews would manage to survive on the island or not, this was not at all important from Eichmann's point of view. He was questioned about the plan, and the court will find his reaction in the transcript. Its cruelty, its lack of any consideration for the value of human lives, the fact that it was full of hostility for the Jews, and that it was drawn up without any regard for the rights of the people of Madagascar. This plan was not much better from a plan of total extermination. A person who was capable of drawing up such a plan, recommending it and struggling for it, certainly did not find it difficult to go over to the next stage of the criminal conspiracy. But it is impudent, it is brazen cheek to recall this plot in the same breath with Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement.
Immediate stages until the very last of those who are carrying out these orders. Eichmann, according to his own statement, had a place in this chain. He was a very important link in this chain of bringing Jews to the camps, knowing full well that there they were going to be exterminated. Here, Eichmann confessed his share in those hideous and unsurpassed crimes. And according to what he said, this is certainly quite enough for the court. But was it all he did? Was it all his share? This microscopical presentation of his office and his authorities can certainly not be convinced. He said himself on one occasion that the accused has a right to lie if this is going to save him. Against what he said, there is a mass of documents that has been accumulated. All sorts of documents amassed during the war. Also documents constituting evidence given by war criminals after the war. And also the police interrogation of the accused. All this testify to him as a central figure in the implementation of the murderous plans. And his defense is only buttressed by his own words. Therefore, perhaps he was so careful in his evidence. Therefore, he was so reticent. And therefore, he was all the time trying to show bad memory. Even if what he said was absurd and in flagrant contradiction to what he said before, he was trying to make a supreme effort to misrepresent facts and always to answer, however absurd it was, in order to wriggle out of responsibility. All the proofs, all the evidence amassed didn't prevent him from speaking all the time on any question that arose. Therefore, he was shocked when he saw the Sassen document where Eichmann spoke about Eichmann, and which was a flagrant contradiction to what he said here in the court. Therefore, he said that they are trying to roast me in this document. And therefore, he said, when he already got his goat, as it were, that he's not going to answer any more questions. He said that the extracts from the Sassen documents that had been committed to the court were not correct. But after all, even those extracts were not necessary in order to bring about the condemnation of Eichmann. We have other documents. Without Eichmann accusing and incriminating himself, we've got enough incriminating documents. And the prosecution does not seek to find the sources of accusation from the accused's own statements, because we do not need it. But the passages accepted by the court were necessary in order to bring out even more distinctly the absurdity of his claim, in order to refute anything he said which is anyway without any connection with truth. The passages which were corrected by him show beyond any shadow of doubt that before this court there is not only a murder of millions, but an inveterate liar who, when pressed to the wall by documents, might the passages which were corrected by him show beyond any shadow of doubt that before this court there is not only a murder of millions, but an inveterate liar who, when pressed to the wall by documents, might make a theatrical gesture and to pay lip service to justice, saying that though he is innocent, he is certainly ready to take the guilt upon himself in order that people shouldn't think that he was trying to extricate himself from responsibility. Eichmann himself
went out and the bloodbath occurred. We have therefore before us the chief executive officer of the extermination. Of course, he has a chief of staff and a minister above him and the head of state above everything, and he is subject to their instructions and their general directives. The signal to open an operation comes from above. But once this signal is given, this man undertook the execution and never ceased, this angel of destruction. Eichmann's status and his authority as chief executive officer in this enterprise and his authority to give binding instruction are explained in another passage from the Zasen documents which I should like to hear, which I should like to read, and which was in fact read here in court. This passage said that he had the right to give instructions to all Gestapo officers, to the advisors on Jewish affairs in the foreign countries, that is to say, to all those people who were concerned with the final solution of the Jewish problem in the roundups and the deportations. And then in cross-examination, when he says that he had only authority to give instructions and not orders, because the Gestapo people were officials and not soldiers, and officials receive instructions while soldiers get orders. Let it be this way. I accept this distinction by Eichmann. He only instructed the Gestapo officials. But his instructions were binding on the entire mighty apparatus to perform the work which he directed and managed, and the practical implementation of which he had planned down to the last detail, the work of deporting people to their death. In this segment of the Zasen document, and in the other passages which I submitted and which bear the accused's corrections, these were not disputed by the accused. He admitted that the gist of these statements were correct. Perhaps he did not exactly put it this way. He says these may not be the very words, but the contents is exact. This is what he said about this passage and about others. Therefore, the contents of those passages which he certified become evidence not because they are part of the Zasen document, but because of what he said here in the witness stand. And once he has confirmed the veracity of the gist of these statements, then this is something which comes from him directly. Direct evidence about his central place in the entire work of extermination. Because of this central position which Eichmann had in the great criminal conspiracy, beginning at the time of the outbreak of the Second World War and even before that, he bears criminal responsibility for the acts of the robbers, the murderers, and the tormentors who carried out the despicable work in all its manifestations. He was part of the criminal conspiracy to carry out Hitler's orders, and if the defense should argue, how can one Obersturmbannführer conspire with officers who are his superiors, with Heydrich, with Kaltenbrunner, with Himmler? Then the answer is that when the order is illegal, there do not exist any longer differences of rank, and they are insignificant. Then we have a gang of murderers which got together to carry out a criminal act. And the second answer is that in the stage of the execution of such a plan, Eichmann is in the center of this conspiracy. Therefore, he bears criminal responsibility for the consequences of this conspiracy in all the stages of its execution and in all its manifestations, down to the last person in a shooting squad of the Einsatzgruppen in Smolensk or in any of the places in the east. He is responsible for the work of the Einsatzgruppen, to which he sent 50,000 Jews. He is responsible because of the conspiracy and the plot to all that happened to the Jewish people from the shores of the Arctic Ocean to the Aegean Sea, from the Pyrenees to the Urals. But his criminal responsibility for oppression, for torment, for starvation, for despoliation, and for murder derives from a legal principle which is very close to the principle of conspiracy, and that is the principle of the complicity in crime.